I'm Peter Kolchinsky, Managing Partner of RA Capital Management. I'm an investor, a scientist, and a food allergy parent. So food allergies are personal for me, as they are for many. And in each episode of this monthly podcast, I'll be speaking with a dynamic thought leader about the grand human quest to conquer food allergies. We'll explore the science of food allergies and technologies to prevent, diagnose, and treat them, as well as the complexities of public policy, insurance, business models, and simply human behavior that, like many entrepreneurs know, can kill seemingly good ideas. So join me and let's talk to the brightest minds on the planet about the food allergy solutions we already have and what's on the horizon. Welcome to Future in Sight. Welcome back, everybody. This is the third episode of Future in Sight, and I'm here with Kari Nadeau, leading researcher in the field of food allergies. And if you've been listening to these episodes in sequence, then you heard Kari's interview with Rob Reed that she did a couple of years ago, actually, and covered so much ground that we didn't want to repeat. We wanted to build on it. So we're going to jump right into it with Kari. We thought what we would do is do a quick inventory of what are the tools that we have available today for managing food allergies, right? And why aren't they good enough? Why don't we just say like, hey, we're good. Like, no need to do further research. Like, we'll just go on vacation. It's all fine. And of course, they're not good enough. And therefore, why are we working on the kinds of technologies that we're working on? Which ones look promising? And are they good enough? Is the end in sight, the end of our worries about food allergies? So I'll pass it on to you, Kari. What are our current tools?
Thank you, Peter. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show again. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here with FAIR and with you. And it's a really honor to be able to talk about these very important topics for patients and families and for researchers. So I believe in really two central tenets of the tools for management. One is that all of our tools should be inspired by patients and families. That whatever tool we choose to manage should be joint decision-making, should be shared decision-making, and should be something that reflects what the patient needs. And the needs have to be formulated by the patient and the family. The other is that in order to have progress, we should also question assumptions always. We should always go back and question assumptions that we've made in the past, myself included, so that nothing is perfect until we make sure that it's an iterative process with our patients to improve their lives. And that's really our essential goal.
Let's give the audience something specific. What's an example of an assumption that maybe wasn't questioned enough and now is, and we're better for it?
Right. I think a lot of people assume that the first thing they need to do, which is right now, a lot of doctors are saying this, is to avoid and carry an EpiPen. That is absolutely critical. That is a good assumption to make. People need to carry an injectable epinephrine device, and for that they don't have now any access to any therapies, you need to avoid the foods you're allergic to. And you should assume to some extent that the labeling is correct in foods, although you need to always be careful with that. And those are some of the assumptions that people have made on labeling laws that now are improving thanks to FAIR and others. But now let's move forward with making good assumptions that science is delivering on its hope and promise to individuals, which includes that now there is oral immunotherapy. Even just 10 years ago, people would come to my office and say, well, there's really nothing that I can do. So why should I even try oral immunotherapy? And that's available now. It's available in the United States in the shape of Palforzia, a peanut flour, and it's the first drug ever to be approved by the FDA, which is great. And I think to me, that's the wind beneath our sails, that's the first ever approved drug, oral immunotherapy, to be able to change someone's threshold by which they're going to react to peanut. And that's a great first step. So it took progress to do that. It took someone saying, wait a minute, I'm going to test my assumptions that all we have to do is avoid food. And instead, let's move forward and try to create a therapy that can help change someo's threshold.
Well, allergists were practicing oral immunotherapy. We're offering it to patients before. Palforzia is the first FDA-approved oral immunotherapy, but it built on a body of knowledge from years of allergists saying, look, I'll give you these little micro doses and gradually increase them of these various foods, and keep coming back to me, and I'll help manage it with you. Right? Why weren't those days good enough? I mean, technically, that's actually still what's available to people with every food allergy other than peanuts, right?
That's right. I think, there's two issues here. One is that people have access to these foods. And so some people will take it upon themselves. And I think there were many doctors that in very good intentions were trying to help their patients. And there were many protocols being published so that perhaps they could do that in Europe and the US. But the problem with this, and you know this really well, Peter, more than I think many people in the whole world, after your book, The Great American Drug Deal, is that we need to democratize, we need to standardize drugs. So what was happening and what still is happening is if a doctor is not using a standardized approach to being able to use oral immunotherapy, or isn't using something that's published, or doesn't quite know what's in the food. Foods can vary in what we call their protein content. And it's the protein that you need to help treat someone. And so let's say you're allergic to pecan, or let's say you're allergic to walnut or cashew. You want a standardized product. And what the FDA allows is that standardization occurs with very rigorous compliance. And that's why I think Palforzia was a great step forward and offered many doctors that ability to not have to worry about dosing it on their own and measuring on their own. Here's something that's standardized and I believe also democratized, so that through third-party payer systems, through our insurance coverage, you're not just going to the clinics that people can pay for their therapy, but that this can be paid by insurance for many in the United States and hopefully in Europe. So that's what's
a really
exciting to me.
Observation, actually, that you just weave together, a huge part of what it means for there to be, a drug, a product, right? It's not just that there's the concept, oh, well, if you have food allergies, tree nut allergy, look, I'll tell you that you can just like grind up a certain amount of tree nuts and just take these doses and you'll be fine. That takes work. You got to go in to see your allergist. That's going to cost you copays, right? Not every food allergist is going to be comfortable, even prescribing oral immunotherapy. They might diagnose, but be like, I've seen too many people get anaphylaxis and stuff like that doing it. I don't really want that liability. And then insurance won't necessarily pay for that, right? I mean, they would say like, look, this is some experimental stuff. It's not FDA approved, right? And so this burden of treatment really falls on the patient, and the doctors are taking some risk, having to sort of interpret what the general latest thinking is of the right dosing regimen. So when a company takes that knowledge and says, all right, we'll do a trial with a product we make in a factory that we standardize to make sure it's got the exact amount of allergen, and every one of our pills will have exactly what we say it has in it. Then when they get the clinical data, you actually have this label that says, here's what you do. It actually allows a lot more doctors, I would imagine, to say, now this I can prescribe. And now insurance says, and this we can pay for because it's a proper tested product, which makes it a lot more accessible to people, right? So
absolutely.
Do you think we can do this for every food allergen? Like what Aimmune did for Palforzia? Do we just block and tackle our way through, the main 9, the other 8 major allergens?
I do, Peter. The reason why is because the burden of proof is huge. The oral immunotherapy is one of the few drugs that has such an incredible, what we call efficacy rate compared to if someone doesn't take it. Now, along the way, while you're taking the same food that you're allergic to, it has to be done very carefully in a clinic that knows what they're doing. So again, when the patient comes and asks about possibly trying oral immunotherapy, we as physicians and the healthcare professionals, the nurses and everyone on the team need to really have a shared decision-making process with that patient and their family to decide what to do. But I completely agree with you. The next steps are the other foods: milk, egg, wheat, cashew, pecan, walnut, tree nuts, and fish and other foods. And I think it's possible. And the reason why I think it's possible is because, number one, we need to do that. There is a huge unmet need in our population across the world where people have multiple food allergies. It's not just peanut. And that's really important. And there are other foods that cause anaphylaxis. It's just not peanut either. So we need to change people's threshold, and it's possible to do safely. The other
Have
reason
we
why I think,
identified, by the way, have we identified the allergens that need to be standardized in each one of those foods? Or are there some where we
absolutely.
are not sure yet, and that work still needs to be done?
Yeah, so a lot of work now has been done from a biochemical standpoint in terms of which allergens need to be standardized, which parts of the allergens, because like, for example, an allergen like wheat may have more than 33 proteins that someone can be allergic to. When you develop a drug to be able to desensitize to wheat, you need to make sure that that product has all those proteins in it, because we want to make sure that any one individual, even though they might be allergic to 1 out of 33 of those proteins, that they're going to get protection. So at Stanford, and I know many other places, they've actually done all the biochemistry on these foods. And we now have developed a product that's patented that Stanford now owns, this part of a company called Allergy, where we do have all of them standardized. They were moved forward thanks to a lot of pioneers, thanks to a lot of research. And that research then enables us to move the product forward. So yes, we have them standardized. Yes, the FDA has reviewed all of the foods. And yes, we now have an IND, which is called an investigational new drug application for this. So I wanted to give the audience some hope that every food, 16 of them at least, are now part of a standardized product that hopefully through, again, rigorous clinical trials can help people with singular and multiple food allergies.
Now, would you expect that we're going to run clinical trials for each one of these? Or when might we say, look, Aimmune showed us the path for peanut, but here's a mixture of all these other food allergens, and we would like to enroll patients with any one of them, combinations of them, and try to show that it's like a standard titration protocol of this mixture, ultimately works, so that it's one big trial, but it's one and done. Like, is that possible? Or do you think the
Yes.
FDA will be like, I don't know, parse this. We're really not certain. You've got to optimize it for each one of these things.
So like one of the big needs I was saying was the unmet need, and that's important, and patients deserve a product, and we do have a product now, a mixture of 16. But in addition, like you're saying, we need some forward thinking. And the FDA, instead of having to wait for one, and that could take many, many years for each of the 16 to go through the gauntlet of FDA approval. And so what I've been really impressed with is the nimbleness and the innovation of the FDA. And I know that that seems like, okay, well, I've heard in the past that maybe the FDA is a little conservative, but in the idea of food allergy, we have a group at the FDA that really has locked elbows with us to be able to try to fast track and to try to get breakthrough therapy designation for new foods for food allergy. And I really credit that belongs to the people there at the FDA that have that mindset for patients that are suffering from food allergy. And we're very grateful that they're working together with us because, like you were mentioning, Peter, it is probably going to take what we call phase 2 trial to do dose finding with many food allergens at once, but the trial can be applied to anyone with any food allergy so that you don't have to do singular approvals each time. And I really think that that was in part reflection of how fast the FDA wanted this to move forward and the fact that they didn't demand that we do one at a time.
You'd probably have to make sure that your clinical trial enrolled enough people with each of the particular food allergies in order to at least show some sort of a benefit in those food allergies, right? But would each one need to be statistically significant, or would it be enough if it were just directionally improved and the statistics were aggregated across, all 16?
It's we have some of the best statisticians around looking at how we design the phase 3. Of course, this all has to be through discussions with the FDA. So far that we know, all proteins are equal. all of the foods that have been tested before have equal opportunity to be able to desensitize someone. So oftentimes my patients ask me, well, I've heard milk is harder to treat than wheat or peanut or cashew. Actually, these are all proteins. When they get into the body, the body sees them all similar. It doesn't know the protein came from a wheat or from a peanut. So we have biology on our side that all of these foods should be equally having the ability to create a better threshold for that individual. But in addition, we need to make sure statistically that we prove significance, like you're saying, because to the FDA, it's all about what we call that p-value when something comes up to the FDA. And we can talk about that with the DBV patch in a second. But within that perspective, it probably is not going to be the case that we need to prove that all 16 are significant, each of their own, but that it's the whole mixture of protein that has an improvement over a placebo arm. We'll have to talk continually with the FDA about this, but because each of these proteins are all similar, when you think about it, for example, with Palforzia, they didn't ask to see that ERA H6 was different from ERA H1, which was different from ERA H2. So if you keep driving this thinking, we are going to take the approach with the FDA that certain ones are going to have to be significant and others can come along because of this cross desensitization aspect. But again, no one knows for sure until we get to that phase 3.
Yeah. So you mentioned the patch. I think it's a good opportunity to segue and ask the question, why would anybody even work on a patch? And, one of the things that I found really compelling about oral immunotherapy is every day you take, a pill that has that peanut allergen in it and you're fine, you're fine. You are desensitized. And, presumably you're not going to go out and eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and intentionally try to get a large dose of peanut butter. But that if any happens to get into your food, if you eat, bread made at a facility that processes nuts or something like that, you're not going to be as worried about it. It broadens the number of foods that you can eat, and that's nice. And you feel generally protected. But with a patch, well, the trouble with oral, of course, is you may have a reaction. You're actually taking that scary food by mouth, and you might have a reaction. So it takes some guts, I would imagine, and this better than I do. I think of it more from a parent, like, what would it take for me to encourage my daughter to do this? And, she doesn't even trust the CDC about, latest mask guidance. She still wants to wear her mask everywhere. So I don't think that I would be able to readily talk her into eating, the foods she's allergic to. But, a patch, well, that seems a lot safer, right? You're just exposing yourself by the skin, but how do you know you're protected? Because unless it's perfect, you don't really know unless you subject yourself to an oral food challenge. So tell us about the pros and cons of taking a patch approach.
Sure. I think everyone deserves choices. I think patients and families oftentimes come with different perceptions and different cultures and different ways they want to be able to interact with a healthcare professional. So I think having choices is key. Oral immunotherapy might not be the choice for everyone. We understand that it works, but during the course of immunotherapy, you can have reactions. They're mostly mild and moderate. They're very manageable. But importantly is you really need to stay close to your doctor. Well, what if someone's traveling? What if there's other options that people have? So during the course of the last 10 years, a company, DBV, developed this patch that you can put on the back of your back or on your skin. And little by little, after that patch lays on your skin, those foods get taken up by your immune system. You can literally see the little immune cells crawl up, pick up the food and bring it down into the tissues. And we thought, wow, this is amazing. Can you really desensitize someone to the same amount that you could oral immunotherapy? Well, it turns out probably not the same amount for everyone. When we talk about developing drugs, as you know, we want the majority of the population to get an effect to a certain level so that we can say, yes, you don't have to worry about accidental ingestion of foods anymore, like your daughter would like. And so with that in mind, the patch was created, and a lot of people after the clinical trial was done could actually, even though they had never eaten the product, could eat a higher level of peanut up to accidental ingestions, but many people couldn't. And it happened to do with your age as well. So it also has to do with how many of these cells you have to come up and grab the food and bring it down. And younger children have more of those cells than older people. So I think DBV learned a lot of science. I think that science can be taken forward. I do hope that they will get approval. I think hopefully people can see that there's staging, that maybe initially they don't want to have to eat the food because it is somewhat like you're saying, jolting. That why should I eat the same food that my parent is telling me not to eat? But I do think you can get over that because that's important to be able to have a life free of worrying about food allergy. But along the way, maybe you take the DBV patch first. So there's a staged process that doctors can do and healthcare professionals with their patients. I'm hoping that the patch will come forward. But what we've learned from the patch is that it worked in a subset of patients. And when it comes to getting something approved, you have to meet the FDA standards. There's no way around it. And these are preset standards, and you need to meet that, what we call that p-value.
Now, there's only a certain amount of protein that one can pack into a patch. Could you imagine doing the 16 allergen, product in a patch form?
When I wrote the patent of the 16 product, yes, you could get it in a patch form. We also are working with other aspects of different epitopes and whatnot, and also with or without microbes or with or without other adjuvants, what we would call them, the helper type molecules. So yes, you can formulate a patch to be able to get all the proteins in that are relevant to be able to desensitize. But you're absolutely right, Peter. We need to get better technology because you don't want a patch the size of, basically a plate. You want to be able to have it be equal and compliant for that. Exactly. So we're working on it, but I do think that it will come that we can do all foods at once, and that's important.
Yeah. So we have one more product that's FDA approved that we should talk about in order to ask, why is it not good enough? Xolair, right? So this is an antibody that you inject once every 2 weeks, and it binds to IgE. This is where it starts to get interesting because you're great with analogies. And I would love for you to share an analogy that puts IgE and Xolair into context. And then later we'll talk about other kinds of antibodies that are in development. But tell us about Xolair. When is it used today? And why isn't it like the solution, like for everybody?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for asking that. And again, when we thought about oral immunotherapy, and many people around the country had been using this, and at Stanford, I had a lot of patients with multiple food allergies, and one of them, Kim Grosso, came up to me after a grand rounds and said, "You've got to start treating multiple food allergies." And at that point, I thought, if we're going to treat multiple food allergies, because of what I would call the multiplicity, if I'm going to give these foods simultaneous to one individual, I want to make sure that we're super protected. And my colleague, Dr. Dale Ametsu, and I were working together, and I was his fellow, and there had already been a clinical trial in which they were using Xolair for other allergies. And what Xolair does is it binds to the match that lights the fire behind allergies. So if you're the match that lights the fire, which is the IgE molecule, so here's this beautiful molecule, it's floating around your blood. There's not very much of it, but when it does get activated, it's very powerful. And I don't need to say that to our audience because they know if they've had an accidental ingestion of a food that they're allergic to, how powerful this IgE molecule does. So when it binds to the allergen floating around in the blood, if that person accidentally ingests that, then that binding then docks into a cell, and that cell then disrupts and creates this havoc upon our bodies like histamine. And that histamine release can happen in as fast as seconds to minutes. And then that's what can cause that mucus and that congestion, and for some people, a near fatal or fatal attack, which is horrible. And so what Xolair does is come in and it will take this IgE molecule and it binds right here on my wrist. And so then it even if this part of the molecule binds to that allergen, it won't be able to dock into its receptor. And so because of that, you have less reactions. You have less capability of causing that histamine release, causing your body to be on fire. So the match isn't lit as frequently. But unfortunately, what happens is you still have some places in your body where that match is in tissues and the Zolar can't get to it. And because of that, Zolar isn't a perfect molecule, but at least it helps. And so when we designed our original trial with Zolar plus using oral immunotherapy together, we were able to move that oral immunotherapy much faster, much higher with a multitude of food allergens at once, because that Zolar was protecting people from reacting. And so that's why we designed it. I'm very grateful that throughout the country, we were able to prove that it worked, and compared to not using Zolar or comparing to not using anything at all. So that's why I think the FDA is taking it forward now with Novartis and Genentech and the NIH towards a breakthrough designation. So I'm hoping that it will be approved for children and adults with food allergies, and that option will be available sometime soon. It is a shot. It's important to know. You can't be guaranteed that it will not allow you to have any food allergy. You still have to be careful. You still have to carry an injectable epinephrine device, but it's a shot that hopefully will pave the way towards improvement in people's lives. And I'm excited about that.
So are there risks from inhibiting all the IgE that you have instead of just the just the match that's tuned to the particular food, that you're allergic to, right? Because you've got a lot of other kinds of IgEs out there that are tuned to other things, guarding your body against, presumably pathogens, right? And for Xolair to inhibit, all those matches, are there risks that people might be mindful of? Or is it a pretty safe approach, would you say?
Nope, like you're alluding to, Peter, we should always, as citizens, as parents, as patients, we should always question things and always think about unintended consequences of anything. And before I use this drug, especially now it's being used in 6 months and above, we need to make sure we look under every rock and look at safety records. So with anti-IgE, luckily, it is a very safe biological inhibitor. However, the one downside is that the protection of IgE against parasites is paramount. And so if you use anti-IgE and you go out in the backwoods of a jungle and you get a parasite, you're going to have less likelihood of being able to kill that parasite. However, you can still kill it with other means. So that's the only downside of using Xolair. So I wouldn't recommend someone going out in the jungle and getting a parasite infection. But on the flip side, here's a really nice aspect. And again, it comes with research and always being open to new data that you didn't expect and questioning assumptions. People started using anti-IgE and they noticed that people, and especially teenagers, were able to fight their viral infections better. So they had less viral induced asthma when they went back to school. And people were saying, gosh, why is that? Well, it looks like when that anti-IgE quenches the IgE molecule, you actually get an upswing of the chemicals that fight viruses. And so that has been something that was positively seen by using anti-IgE.
Yeah. And Xolair is approved now for the treatment of asthma,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And so, presumably, if you've got asthma and food allergies, which is not uncommon, you're already getting the benefits of Xolair, shielding you against, adverse food reactions, but not entirely, at least not in all people, right? And so
Right.
there might be, there's interest in finding other ways to dampen that fire, right? So there's a drug in development called dupilumab that binds IL-4 receptor, right? So tell us about that mechanism what's its role if IgE is like a match that can be activated by binding to a food allergen? What is the IL-4
Yeah,
receptor doing?
so it's a great question. So we talked about Xolair, we talked about its use with oral immunotherapy. It also could perhaps be used without oral immunotherapy. So again, it's nice to have options, but it's nice to see what's the best option for you and whether or not it's safe and FDA approved. But in addition, when we have now studied the allergy pathways, and it's again through a lot of science, this is all based on science and data, and without pioneers coming in front of us and doing clinical research, we would never be at this stage to be able to answer your questions. So everything that I'm answering, it's really thanks to pioneers that have gone before us to do clinical trials, and I'm very grateful for that. And with that in mind, now that we have a good stream of pioneer drugs that are being used in therapy ahead of us, now the new things that are being tested, like dupilumab, you don't have to go all the way back to ground zero and test against placebo, i.e. eating nothing. So now fast forward, and now we have some more things in our pockets to test, yay. And dupilumab actually is further up the chain in these allergy pathways. So it inhibits the pathway even before your body makes IgE. So what if we could inhibit here so that you never make IgE in the first place? That would be ideal, right? Because IgE, for the most part, especially in food allergy, is the problem molecule. And so
You do not have any IgE at all, or would it spare you from having the food allergen IgE?
it actually inhibits upstream so that it decreases all IgE. But it takes time. It takes a lot of time to be able to use that, like you said, anti-IL-4 receptor alpha blockade to then train the immune system to stop making IgE. It also stops making a lot of other molecules, which is great. IL-4 is one of those main cytokines that causes itching. And so for people with eczema, atopic dermatitis, that was one of the first things that dupilumab was approved in, because it stopped itching, which to a lot of people, that's great, right? But nothing is perfect. This is a biological, so it requires an injection. You can do it at home. It's been found to be safe. They're giving it in 6 months and above now for dupilumab. It has been tried in food allergy. When we look at how well it reduces IgE, it can take a while. So that's why when you do take it, we need to watch these, what we call biomarkers. And again, this is the advancement of science working for patients and families, that because we now have the new knowledge that this inhibitor could work against allergy, we also need to watch that in any one patient to make sure that that's what's happening. And because many people with food allergies also have asthma, eczema, eosinophilic esophagitis, perhaps, this molecule helps with many of those conditions. And I'm excited about using it. And when we think about it, it could also be used in combination with Xolair. You could use Xolair first and then flip over to dupilumab. Take all the IgE out of the system for as much as you can with Xolair, and then use dupilumab to make sure that there's no more IgE being made. So it's things like this where we want to be creative scientifically. We want to be super safe for patients. But at Stanford, we're doing this trial now to see how one biologic can help the other. And most importantly, help patients.
So we've got Xolair approved for asthma. We've got dupilumab currently approved for the treatment of atopic dermatitis.
And asthma.
And asthma, that's
and
right.
Allergic rhinitis.
So those conditions all overlap with food allergies. So there's plenty of data now, if one looked, on how it would appear to be impacting food allergies themselves. There are studies ongoing. Xolair has completed those studies, and the FDA has been given the data in the hopes that Xolair will have its label expanded to now include how it should be used for the treatment of food allergies. Dupilumab, have we seen the data yet to know how well it works, or is that coming up?
That is coming up very soon.
Yeah.
So the trial was just finished with using dupilumab with peanut oral immunotherapy with the Palforzia. And when you move something through the FDA, you usually want to move one thing at a time. So when you try to advance one new drug, you need to use already an FDA-approved drug to be able to find its efficacy. So that's what the Regeneron company did, and I'm excited about those results. So hopefully they're coming out soon.
Yeah. Well, so it's an interesting combination, right? Because basically what it's saying is you could have started your oral immunotherapy without the benefit of a Xolair or dupilumab, but it's kind of like what we were saying before. People might be nervous that they will have some reactions. After all, they are taking the very food that they've been working so hard to avoid, and so they might get various kinds of adverse events, and the worst being possibly anaphylaxis. And so if you have these immune dampeners on board, that are preventing your matchsticks from going off, as you purposely load up your body with this, food allergen, then the hope is that you just have a safer oral immunotherapy experience. And I know that there's one theory out there that maybe you might be able to load up on enough oral immunotherapy that maybe it like permanently desensitizes you, right? And that you'll be able to stop taking that daily pill of food allergen, and just simply not worry about food allergies again. Do you see evidence of that? Is that likely? Or are there trials that might read out that tell us whether or not that'll work? Or should we reconcile ourselves with, no, you're probably on oral immunotherapy indefinitely. You got to take a pill every day to know that you're protected.
Uh, I do believe it's possible because we've seen it in the data. So it's not really about a belief system, but rather that that's what the data is showing you. And I really appreciate you asking me this question because it's kind of the holy grail of any therapy. When you think of cancer, when you think of autoimmune disease, when you think of organ transplantation, we want to try to minimize medications, maximize effect. And many people will ask me, do I have to take this peanut every day? Do I have to eat the cashew every day for the rest of my life? When I go to college, if I forget to take my medicine, my food, will I have a reaction again? And will I get back my allergy? So these are very practical questions as well. And with that in mind, we test that. And many people have tested that throughout many clinical trials. So you have to design a clinical trial, which you get someone up to a higher level of food, and then you take them off. And some trials do that in a blinded way. Some people don't. But whatever that is showing for any age, it's not just children, it's not just infants, it's not just adults, but any age, and I'm really impressed with the immune system, any age has that capacity to become tolerized, to become educated in their immune system. I've treated 99 to 100 years old with shrimp food allergy, and they can get better. So I just want to also make sure that there are people that think that somehow this concept of tolerance can only happen in young children. That's not the case.
Well, what's the
But
rate? If you had 100 people that start oral immunotherapy and they stick with it diligently for, I don't know, shall we say a year, that they would then be able to say, I consider myself protected. I'm just going to go out and eat whatever I want and know I'm not going to take this
right,
capsule every day. What
yeah.
percentage of them will discover 6 months or a year later that indeed they're fine versus, oh no, I'm
Right.
having reactions?
And you want, like you're asking for these population percentages, and I'll give you them in a second, but for any one individual, you don't know where you are in that percentage. And so it's really critical that you talk to your physician, that you get the right test so that you know, can I eat ad lib or not? So with that, we've been developing biomarkers. And to answer your question, if you take a typical allergy therapy like peanut or cashew or some of the other foods that we're doing now, and you stop for 6 weeks, 50% of the population will not be able to get up to the same amount that they did before they stopped for 6 weeks. However, no one goes back to baseline. Does that make sense? So
It
let's say you were,
does. It means in the pursuit of the holy grail that maybe you're the 1 or 2 out of 100 that is truly cured, far more people are taking a 50% chance that they are, possibly forever going to be less well protected than if they had just stayed on the therapy.
that's
It doesn't mean that they'll give it up, that protection up forever. uh, they'll still have some residual. There'll be a consolation prize for trying. But it does make me wonder, is the chance of that holy grail cure high enough to warrant anybody rationally foregoing the protections of just staying the course?
Yeah, I
Continuing
think
therapy.
to answer that question, we should ask patients, right? Because many people came through these clinical trials, and just like when people get allergy shots, just like when people take Synthroid for thyroid disease, they have to take it every day. They can't stop. I mean, this is something that they know is going to be a permanent fixture in their medicine cabinet, because if you stop, there's no proof that if you have a thyroid disease, that by stopping the medicine that you're taking, you're going to get permanently cured. In fact, that's not the case.
Right.
So in the same rubric, in the same mindset, someone goes through food immunotherapy. And what we need to do is to be able to have better biomarkers to let that person know, are you in the 50% that is going to be okay, or are you not? But importantly, it's the tincture of time. If you go off for 6 months, only 30% of the individuals will be able to reach that same threshold before they went off for 6 months. After a year, we've tested that too. It's only 13% that are quote unquote sustained unresponsive or tolerant. So that degree of protection is somehow leaving that person's body. Now we're looking at biomarkers, we're looking at genetics, we're looking at things that you can test before you take people off, but nothing is perfect. So right now, what we tell people is like the scenario of Synthroid, please keep taking your medicine. We know that if you keep taking your medicine, your drug, your food allergen every day, and maybe every other day, and maybe you don't have to take as much, but importantly is take it at least so that your body sees that food protein so that it stays desensitized. And to a lot of people, they're willing to do that. To others, that might be seen as an inconvenience. So maybe they want to take a biological that gives them a shot every month that protects them outside of eating a food. These are the types of scenarios that we want to be able to talk to our patients about.
There's some analogies in medicine, right? There's disease like hepatitis B, which is a virus that's incredibly difficult to cure you of, really hangs in there in your liver. But we do have evidence that people can clear it spontaneously. And with treatment, there's a very low probability, less than 10%, that if you discontinue treatment, the virus stays managed, right? And when you see that little bit, that wedge of hope, that technically it's not zero, that's where science says, all right, well, if I add additional medicines, can I really hit the virus harder? And then, will I discover I can turn 10% into 20, into 30? And so we build on that, right?
Absolutely, Peter. We want that wedge to be a pie. And that's the other reason why we're using the dupilumab and Xolair, because we actually think that by giving those biologics, it's not about safety, but it's also about potentially cures. So we're hoping that that will work. And the vaccines and many other new technologies could perhaps actually switch the immune system to become a cure.
I'm glad you mentioned vaccines, because there's work ongoing with technologies that are described as vaccines. In some sense, oral immunotherapy is like a vaccine, I guess, right? It's giving you an exposure to the pathogen, little micro doses of the pathogen that you're scared of, in order to get your immune system to adapt to it in some way. Though it is pretty different than what we think of as a vaccine response to a pathogen, where we want to make the immune system really rev up and react. Here, we're trying to get the immune system to sort of realize, wow, I sure am seeing a whole lot of this. Are we so sure it's a bad guy? Maybe it's just like regular food, right? So it's a different kind of vaccine. But tell us a bit about what are the merits of some of these peptide vaccines and things that are injected in people. Like, what are we trying to achieve with them that we aren't doing with oral immunotherapy?
I'm really excited that because of other technologies with vaccines, that we have some options now. We're testing them, and that's great. The FDA is allowing them to be tested, and I myself have been an investigator in these trials at our Stanford research unit at the Sean Parker Center. So there's one vaccine that says, well, wait a minute, what if we take the pieces of the protein that don't cause allergies? And that company is called Aravax from Australia. And they actually inject that into people, and they're training the immune system with parts of the protein that are more tolerogenic. And it's hard for us to know if they're truly tolerogenic until the trial is done. But scientifically, we think they are. So that's one vaccine. Another vaccine company called Astellas, they actually took pieces of the peanut protein. They injected inside your skin very carefully and under a lot of control. And then you become a person that's making that peanut protein in very defined doses over time. It's exactly like you're saying, Peter. The body says, wait a minute, I'm producing this on my own. That why should I be worried about it? And then it quickly tolerizes to those very small, minuscule amounts of protein that are being made underneath your skin. So that's another type of vaccine.
What's the technology they're using in order to get production of the protein?
It's called the LAMP. It's a plasmid. It's called the LAMP vaccine. It was originally patented at Johns Hopkins and then developed by a company called Astellas because they've been using it for other types of technologies and vaccines. There's another vaccine being developed out of Europe called the Halvax vaccine. So I think that one of these hopefully will move forward. The other components to vaccines, as we kind of know it from a public standpoint, is could I have something like what was done for COVID? Could I have a monoclonal antibody that protects me against an infection, or in this case, that protects me against having an allergy? And there are many companies moving that forward as well. Regeneron has a product now that they're moving forward for cat allergy. So in the same analogy, there are companies that are now moving that same concept forward for food allergies. Because many people that, like I was talking about, because of your excellent questions about can people get cured? How do we know whether or not someone's desensitized? Well, you can do skin tests, but you can also look at this molecule in their blood called IgG. And it's the best biomarker we have right now. There's a bunch of other ones, but they're not as easily accessible to the public.
So if IgE is like a bunch of matches that are tailored to recognize a particular protein, and if they bind it, they strike and they light the kindling of your immune cells that now like explode with activity, then IgG would be what? Like a pair of pliers that just like grabs hold but doesn't, spark a crazy reaction?
It's the insulation, it's the sand, it's the water, it's what takes down the match. And we know that this is what nature does. If you look at people that are naturally losing their allergies, right? Because that's what we want. We want to have the immune system look like those people that naturally lost their allergies, because those people don't get allergies back at the same rate. They don't increase their rate of what we call recidivism. It's the same rate as anyone would have in terms of getting back their allergies. So that's great. So when we looked at those people, we saw that they had this 1,000 to 1. You need about 1,000 molecules of IgG to create that dampened response to the IgE. And that's what Mother Nature does. And people can still have that IgE molecule around, but if you have these other molecules around to dampen and quench that match, then it doesn't react. And so it doesn't react in all tissues.
It's not really binding the match, it's binding the allergen that the match is tuned to, right? So basically, if you can make enough of these non-overreactive antibodies that flood and coat your allergen and therefore keep it away from the matches, then you're protected. Right. And so some people's immune systems have naturally started producing IgGs against the food that they were allergic to, and those people lose their food allergies. This is an observation that you can make about some of those people that are cured. And so then can you replicate that for people who aren't so lucky that their immune system stumbled upon that solution? And so we've got companies like Regeneron, you mentioned, and you're involved with one.
Exactly, IGeneX, there's another company.
Right.
So
you're still going to need to give people injections of these antibodies, right? So it takes a lot of skill to make an antibody that's really potent, long-lived, so that it's as few injections as possible. Just going back to the vaccine approach, though, that we were talking about before, the hope, I presume, is that you can somehow trigger through maybe one shot or a course of shots a permanent benefit, no?
Exactly.
Right?
That's right. So with the vaccines that I was talking about, the three, the Aravax, the Astellas with the Lampvax, and then also the Halvax, is that hopefully by giving it frequently, just like we give vaccines for viruses or bacterial infections, that the presumption there is you'll give it maybe 4 times and then see how long it lasts for. Maybe you have to give boosts. Whereas this other molecule we were talking about, the molecule that kind of quenches the fire, but it basically does that by sopping up all the allergens so that it never binds to the Ig, it never gets to
Yeah.
the match. And importantly, with that concept, you would have to give monthly injections, for example.
Yeah.
But the vaccine, that capability of modulating the immune system, that could be permanent. All of these scenarios could be permanent. There's also another mechanism by which that IgG4 docks into cells and creates an inhibition against making IgE. So we're learning a lot about the immune system. There's regulatory T cells, other cells that we think to be important, basophils. So I talk about these one molecules, but I want to do it in all humility because the immune system has taught me to be very humble, and that we think maybe there's one item, which I'm talking about right now, IgG, but we need to make sure we follow all the others so that it's complementary to a person's immune system and that we are holistic in being able to tell people if they've lost their allergy or not.
It's kind of like we're building a hardware store, right? Each tool has to be proven to have a use. And that can be pretty tedious and hard because the reality is that you never actually do anything of significance. You don't build a house or renovate your bathroom or whatever with one tool. And yet it's important to prove the safety and efficacy and the benefit risk of each tool. But once we do, once we find that perfect trial, that perfect patient population where you say, well, this IgG works, for cashews, or what have you, right? Then you start to say, well, now that I have this, what if I combine oral immunotherapy and the, IgG against that same allergen, and I give dupilumab, or Xolair, or both, or I don't know, there will be people who mix and match all these tools with the hope of achieving the holy grail, which is a cure, not lifelong injections, which, I mean, there are people who go, kids with type 1 diabetes, they put up with that, so it's not beyond the pale to imagine that you're going to have people that just say like, all right, lifelong injections it is. Can I have them less frequently, please? So dupilumab, I think, is once every 2 weeks, maybe once a month. There's another molecule, IL-33, that I believe would be once a month. It hits another part of the immune system. So you might get to things that are once every 3 months, like an IgG, in theory, it might have the potential to be given, once a month or once every 3 months, let's say. It depends how well it's engineered.
That's right. It's all engineering.
Right?
That's right.
But could you achieve a cure? And so I think as long as we keep in mind, that it would be valuable for the rest of all time to have a protocol and a set of drugs that allows us to get to cures so that people can truly just forget that they ever had food allergies and not worry about it, not think about it, not have to, worry that their insurance will drop coverage of a drug that they're dependent on. Then there will be researchers that are willing to try these different components. I do worry a little bit that sometimes when early treatments turn out to seemingly be good enough, that suddenly the idea of like, well, what if we had better becomes not as pressing, and people worry that insurance won't pay for it. And I'll give you an example. HIV. We have drugs now that are so incredibly good at managing HIV that even though it's incredibly compelling to say, but what if we had a cure? Cures don't come easily. Cures could come with significant toxicity. They could involve cell transplants, and they would likely be very expensive. And the expectation that very few people who are HIV positive and have managed to resume essentially a normal life, on these, very well characterized HIV medications, might hesitate before adopting, going for a curative treatment. then the companies that are making it would have to say like, well, let's assume that we might get used by like 1% of patients, maybe the ones that are struggling with their medications and, are worried about progressing to AIDS. So we're going to have to charge a lot for the very few people. And so insurance will say, well, if you're going to charge a lot, we're really going to restrict it. And so, you could imagine how the fact that you have a pretty good chronic treatment, ultimately hinders the pursuit of a true cure, right? So we're nowhere near it, but I'm going to call it that it's a risk facing this space.
Yeah, for me, as a scientist, as a mom, as a parent, as a pediatrician, as an adult doctor, complacency to me is the worst part of medicine. You never want to say to a patient, I don't have any options for you, or we see this. To me, that sense of giving up hope, or in any one individual, if therapy doesn't work, I want to make sure I have options for them. I think people deserve options. In your perspective, I completely understand that to de-risking drug development, that if you have something out there that works the majority of the patients, why would you want to have other things come up the road? But I think it's imperative, because I think there are going to be people that want choices. I think there are going to be scenarios where one particular regimen doesn't work for that person or a group of people. And I think also because food allergy is global, there are no boundaries. And all age groups and all ethnicities are affected by this particular disease. It is truly its own epidemic. I do believe we're going to really have to cut across many different ways to give desensitizations: oral immunotherapy, sublingual immunotherapy, patches, biologics, so that we can have the ability to treat many people globally. So I'm hoping that that will be the inspiration behind third-party payers, behind drug companies really getting new molecules out there, because we do want a cure, we do want that moonshot, but along the way, we can really personalize this and mitigate the disease with different types of therapies, but the combination of these therapies might work even better than one alone.
I think if we think about the idea that, 8% of adults, give or take, various papers say 5 to 10%, have a food allergy. And some are more serious than others, but the reality is, like, if you're not sure whether you're the one with a serious allergy, it affects you as if you have a serious allergy, right? Because you're worried, you're constantly anxious, you avoid certain foods, people have to cater to you. The military won't, enlist you, right? If you have a history of a food allergy, and hopefully we'll speak with somebody from the military to talk about, how that's not a risk they're willing to accept. And it's a permanent tax on our society, right? Measured in, I think, like tens of billions of dollars a year or more.
Exactly. Over $20 billion a year spent just on the reaction side of treating reactions in the emergency room and other items.
So when you spread that across the many, many more people that don't have reactions but have to adjust their lifestyle, the schools that have to have separate tables, et cetera, it's a monstrous expense for society. And there's no end in sight, and it seems to only be growing. But what if we had a cure, or prevention? Frankly, basically, what if we retired this risk, right? What would that be worth to society, right? And when you think about retiring something that maybe costs $50 or $100 billion a year over the course of like just a century to retire it, it's worth trillions of dollars, right? And it's like, well, what if we just said, how about we spend $1 trillion to retire this? Then it's good money, right? Like, you're saving trillions of dollars. You only spent $1 trillion. That should be, worthwhile. And we're talking about just for the U.S. I mean, if the whole rest of the world looked at it this way collectively, but spending $1 trillion, like, you don't do it all at once. You don't do it up front. You do it by saying, what if we rewarded each of like 20 drugs that addressed 5% of the problem, which is not to say that they, only work 5% of the time. It's that for maybe 5% of patients, they work really well, or they solve half the problem for 10% of the patients, right? But if you had these 20 drugs, and if each one of them were rewarded at a level of, I don't know, even $5 billion a year. I mean, like, that's a lot. It's not as much as the biggest drugs like Humira have sold, but $5 billion is a huge reward, like tons of incentive to do all kinds of research, right? And if they were branded for 15 years and then went generic, so 5 times 15, that's $75 billion, right?
Right.
And times 20 drugs, that would be $1.5 trillion. So,
Exactly.
if society thought big and realized like, wow, if we offered essentially 20 prizes like that, if we were willing to accept that, we could chip away at this problem. And hopefully in a matter of decades, we'd have this arsenal, which then after they collected their rewards, they'd be 20 generic drugs. And we would be able to manage, food allergies, hopefully
Yeah.
perfectly for the rest of all time. Like that's
Yeah.
the vision, right?
Exactly. And that's the big vision, because you see that, and you see it because of your knowledge and expertise, which is awesome. This is the kind of thinking we also need to lay out a plan. I think organizations like FAIR, I'm so glad to work with them because they're thinking about the future and there are advocates for families. But we also need to make sure we advocate on the Hill, US Congress, FDA, so that we can think about all these structures and be able to spend the upfront cost to be able to really get to a cure. Absolutely agree. But along the way, we're going to definitely mitigate the disease. And that's
Yeah.
what's exciting too, is to see all of the benefits. Every year I have luckily been on this planet, I've seen food allergy therapy improve. And
Yeah.
that's great. And the same thing for diagnostics, the same thing prevention. All the needles are pointing in the right direction.
Well, those rewards are sizable. They're affordable for society. I would argue that they would be uh, quite inspiring for researchers and investors, saying like, oh, if I succeed, if I can bring one of these vaccines, I can make, we can make $5 billion a year. Like that would be plenty.
Right.
And they can be rendered affordable to patients through insurance.
That's right.
I'm curious, just as we sort of move to wrap up, what's your experience been with insurance coverage of the various drugs, that are out there for patients, whether it's the EpiPen or even Xolair off-label, or, Palforzia, the peanut oral immunotherapy. Generally speaking, is insurance, accommodating, or do you see them being difficult?
I can come at this from my own point of view as a physician. I don't have the numbers for the whole US, but here practicing in California, in both children and adults, using dupilumab and Xolair for other allergic disorders like asthma or atopic dermatitis, for every one that I've tried to get dupilumab or Xolair approved for, I can. It takes work. You need to really know the system. But if doctors have that tenacity with their healthcare providers, with the nurses to be able to fill out the right forms, it's possible. I haven't seen anyone not get insurance approval for an FDA approved indication.
Do they still have out-of-pocket costs after they get it approved?
And they still have out-of-pocket costs.
I'm curious, as a physician, what's the purpose of out-of-pocket costs in theory?
I hear you.
Like this skin in the game thing that they talk about, right? It's,
after reading your book, and of course, I already had this impression, like, why do that? You look at other countries where they don't have out-of-pocket costs. In fact, you look at Scandinavia, you look at other, and those people still benefit. They still have the same incentives to be able to get their therapy. The out-of-pocket costs, to me, only serve as a deterrent. And I've had patients.
Deterrent to appropriate utilization, because you just described filling out a bunch of paperwork to prove to the insurance company that this patient actually needs this drug. So they authorize coverage, agreeing that it's appropriate, and then they still put up these out-of-pocket costs that, at least we know in America, some patients can't afford.
Exactly, which are obstructive to the care that I'm providing, but also the recipient being able to get better. And the worst case is the injectable epinephrine pen, where, in the old days, there used to be this copay or other types of payments, or they had to pay out of pocket, period. And so certain people didn't have the ability to pay for that. So you had people going around without epi. So I think there are compassionate use. There are ways to now move through the system to be able to get drugs without a copay, but that takes an additional amount of work, and you have to prove to the system that that person can't pay the copay. So it does make me think that this whole thing needs to be restructured, and I know that could be a topic of another whole podcast for sure, and then some. But to answer your question, for Palforzia, for example, that's difficult to answer with third-party payers for Palforzia. So far that my colleagues have used it in the country, they are getting insurance reimbursement for it. But because it came out during the time of COVID, I don't have the numbers that might help you to answer that question yet.
Well, we started our discussion talking about how the product is not just the idea, it's the validation of the idea, it's figuring out how to properly use something, it's having a label for it, it's the proper manufacturing for it, right? And then it's the actual insurance coverage of that, so it's accessible. The whole thing has to come together in order for there to be a product. Otherwise, if any of those things are missing, if the insurance coverage is missing, it's just a tease. It just makes you aware of what you're missing out on, you know. Or if you've got some basic science research that says, I think we could develop this vaccine, but there's no private sector investment because they know that they're not going to get covered by insurance. So they're like, there's no reward. Why are we going to risk, you know, anything? You can't talk any investors into risking capital to fund your studies. So now all you are is teased by the idea that my basic science tells me I think this could work, but I'm sorry, I can't give you a product. I can't afford the clinical trials. So I would argue, you know, that as patients, patient advocacy groups, you know, as they think about what should we be lobbying for, advocating for, you know, demanding, really, you have to think holistically about the whole product, right? Everything from the basic science of it to demanding that insurance make these things, reimbursed. At the end of the day, insurance is the only thing that makes innovation possible. You know, people don't connect that, you know, but if we didn't think that insurance was going to make these high rewards that are necessary to spur investment affordable to patients by actually spreading them out across everybody, if we thought insurance would dump a bunch of that reward on the shoulders of a small, you know, patient population that couldn't afford it, then, you know,
that's right,
you'd never pursue the investment.
No. That's right. It has to be attributed to the whole population, and insurance does create that pathway by which we can have scenarios to be able to keep this moving forward. Like you're saying, the whole train has to be built together to be able to get to that end goal. And I know there are a lot of other issues in terms of insurance reimbursement, but we need to make sure as patients, as physicians, as companies developing drugs, that we can advocate for that third-party payer system early. You know, while trials are going on, phase 2, phase 3, we should be talking to insurance companies then to think about what's the pathway to make sure this is possible in the end. Because if you have all these pieces of the puzzle, like you're saying, and if you don't have insurance reimbursement, what was the reason for doing all that? So I'm hoping that more and more patients can really move this forward. I was very impressed at the FDA meeting during Palforzia that patient groups were there, that they made sure their voice was heard. But what I'm hoping is that can be done earlier in the process. The third-party payers really need to talk more to patient groups and to see why this is so important.
There will come a point when groups like ICER and NICE that do math equations to tell you which drugs are worth it and what the value of treating food allergies might be, they will set their equations on, you know, these unmet needs, and they will calculate what you know, a reasonable price is and what it's not, and based on what we've seen them do for diseases like Alzheimer's or cystic fibrosis, their math will be very narrow. It would be akin to turning to your financial advisor when you're thinking of buying an electric car and saying, should I buy this car? And you know, he says, oh, well, actually it's a higher price than a standard car, so no, you shouldn't. And meanwhile, it's like, but the maintenance costs are lower and the fuel costs are lower. And it's like, well, my equations don't take that into account, so you still shouldn't buy it. And so, you know, can you imagine a financial
No,
advisor that's that terrible? And then
no,
you later discover that they basically work for like the gasoline industry. And you're like, oh, now I understand. You know,
right.
they're trying to talk you out of making, actually wise investment decisions. And so what you see conventional health economists that practice this very simplified cost effectiveness math, what they would do, they would ignore the burden of food allergies on the entire family. They would simply say, well, what is the benefit to the patient, but not consider the caregivers, right? They would ignore the burden on schools, restaurants, on airlines, and by ignoring all that, they failed to capture that we as a society are already spending tens of billions of dollars, maybe more on this problem. And the question is, would you like to spend less on treatments and prevention or more on the status quo?
Absolutely. And what is that going to take? Should we be educating insurance companies? Should we be educating ICER on what are all these multi-factors that play a role in the overall capability of visualizing something that improves people's lives, right? And how do you put a price tag on that? But like you're saying, food allergy is so disabling across perimeters and perimeters and perimeters of aspects to that one individual that's the node that has the disease, that has to be taken into account when thinking about insurance reimbursement and the positives and the value to which that therapy brings to that individual. So to capture that, I mean, there are, I'm sure, analogies to other diseases which you invest in a specific product and you see this amplitude of improvements on many different sectors, and hopefully that valuation can happen.
And Stanford did this work, actually. I'm now reminded. So this idea of cost effectiveness math being oversimplified and ignoring some of the value of an innovation. Stanford looked at the way that health economists valued vaccination programs. And they found that in some countries, as they did the math to figure out, should we pursue this vaccination program for cholera, let's say,
right.
That some formulas, some equations said, no, it's too expensive, don't do it. But what they ignored was the property of vaccines of offering herd immunity, that if you vaccinate 70% of people, you actually protect the other 30% without having to find them, and inject them, pay for the vaccine. So you're getting a lot more value because of herd immunity than, just protecting people that were vaccinated.
Exactly.
And so what these Stanford health economists did is that said, if you, factored in herd immunity, you discover that programs that before you deemed to be not cost effective, and therefore some countries might have decided not to implement, right, in fact become cost effective. And had you not made that math mistake, you might have pursued the vaccination program, or you logically should have, and then you could have saved lives. So math errors can really hurt, right?
Yeah,
can hurt
absolutely.
people. And Stanford actually showed that, by looking at the vaccine studies. If there are people that Kari, maybe talk to them about turning their sharp eyes.
We need to do this for food allergy. Absolutely. There's so many factors that we need to have. When I was working with ICER and I went to the initial ICER meeting, it was clear that they, like you're saying, have a very narrow scope on their math. And I'm hoping that they can increase that scope, but we need to kind of give them the tools by which to do that. So I'll go back and work with the Stanford economists. I'll look forward to getting those names from you. But I really do believe that food allergy, just in the past 20 years that I've been in this field, has really taken a good course to help people. But like you're saying now, we have to deal with all these details to make sure that all that science, all the work that's being done, actually has an ending that makes sense to society and to valuation and third-party payers.
Well, Kari, this has been a real pleasure, doing this tour of innovation with you. And, let's plan on coming back together in maybe, a year and taking stock of all the progress that has occurred over that year. And hopefully, some of those results will point to some meaningful breakthroughs, right? That's what we're in.
Absolutely. Well, Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being part of the Thera podcast, and thank you for a great interview. Really appreciate it. And I hope all will go well with you and your family, and stay safe.
Thank you.